Welcome, time crunched fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. On this podcast, we talk a lot about what we can do to train your physical self. Intervals, long rides, time and zone, recovery modalities, you name it. If you've listened to the show before, you know that we answer a ton of your questions on how best to navigate training decisions when you're tight on time or you're trying to figure out how to take it to the next level. We don't talk much about the way of the mind, the governor of what moves you. We don't talk as much about what actually motivates you as an athlete. Most of the time, I find that the athletes I work with, and equally those of you listening to me right now, are for the most part really motivated to do your training and all the things needed to be, quote, a good athlete, end quote. But what about when you're not? What happens when you're just not motivated to be a good athlete, to do your long ride, to do your intervals? How do you direct mental energy into positive motivation? This can be a challenge for any athlete at any given time in their performance journey. And if you've been doing this endurance sport long enough, you know that the ebbs and flows of these emotions can be tricky to navigate at different times. Now, before we get going into the show today, I'll let you know, because this is a bigger topic, we've got a few episodes around it. So this is part one in a 2-part series. And based on feedback from you, our listeners, maybe I'll incorporate more of this into future podcasts and get some other sports psychologists and researchers on the pod. Also today, we're going to look at motivation in the lens of observing athletes and learn how to identify where motivation comes from, how it can change or flex over the season. And then in part 2, I'll interview a fellow coach where we'll develop and give you strategies and tips on how to harness the power of motivation to elevate performance. Now, my final disclaimer here is I'm a coach, not a psychologist, not a sports psychologist, nor do I have certifications in any of that. However, as a coach, we actually do have, and I lean heavily on sports psych practices in everything I do, as you can't actually separate mind from body when you're working with an athlete. So consider this episode to be educational and full of ideas that you can apply to your training. But topics I cover today are derived both from the latest research and articles on this subject, as well as my own personal experience with my athletes. Finally, please know that much of what I'm going to talk about today is a mere skimming of the surface when it comes to topics like motivation, drive, and passion. This is to get a basic understanding of concepts and terms for the next podcast and maybe some future podcasts, all of which will help you understand more about yourself, what drives you to do what you do as an athlete, and as a result, help you increase better outcomes toward your goals. Okay, now with all that preface, let's get started today. Okay, where does motivation come from? Well, as I've alluded to, it's a pretty big question, of which, from the research I read, sports psychologists I've interviewed and had conversations with, motivation is a complex emotion, and there's many factors to it. As listeners know, I like to start with working definitions. I think it helps us to be grounded in what we're talking about and then help build from there. So let's define motivation. The best and most simple way I've heard this defined actually comes from Rob Griffiths, and he's an athlete, executive coach, facilitator, and I'll talk about the article and link to it later. But here's his definition. Motivation is commonly understood as those inner thoughts and feelings that start, guide, and maintain our actions toward our goals. It fuels our desires. It's a pretty good definition if you think about it. I'll read it one more time. Motivation is commonly understood as those inner thoughts and feelings that start, guide, and maintain our actions toward our goals. It fuels our desires. But let's go back to the original question. Where does motivation come from? In the context of an athlete in this case. But keep in mind, athletes are still humans. So I turn to some of the well-established science out there, and this term may be common to some people out there because, it spills over to way more than sports psych. And so this concept of self-determination theory is researched and originally developed by psychologists Richard Ryan and Edward Deci. In fact, Edward Deci is the author in one of my go-to books on this, and it's called Why We Do What We Do, Understanding Self-Motivation. So go ahead and pick that up. I think that's a great resource if anyone is looking to read and learn more about self-determination theory. So SDT, as it's abbreviated as, has three components. They're autonomy, competence, and connectedness. And when we're talking about autonomy, that's your freedom to choose. And that's really anything, but let's observe this in the lens of an athlete. So when we're talking about autonomy for an athlete, that's saying, as a coach anyway, or as an athlete, you get to choose your goals. You get to choose your races. You get to choose your training, or you get to choose your coach who gives you your training. And there's still some autonomy given there, of which we'll talk about on part 2. Competence. This is the need to develop potential or getting better at something. Okay. In endurance sports, that's getting better at descending. It's getting better at hill climbing. It's improving your race tactics, or just improving your performance overall. Finally, there's the connectedness. And this is the need to experience mutually satisfying social relationships. So this is spending time with your team, your club, your endurance community, getting out to the races, being with your friends that do the same thing that you're doing, being connected to the personal relationships in the sport. And the self-determination theory is all helping to help you, the athlete, understand why you're motivated to do what you're doing as an athlete. When I'm working with my athletes, I observe myself as incorporating these three components. When stuff gets rough, for example, I'll say, hey, remember, you chose to sign up for this race. You chose to sign up for this Ironman. Now we're in the thick of it. Now we're in the thick of training for it. So let's go. Just as one general example. Additionally, in the way of competence, if we have a really good hill climb day, I'll say, see, you're getting better at hill climbing. It's no longer the drudgery. Like your VAM is increasing. Your power to weight ratio is increasing. You're getting more competent at this. You're developing potential. And then finally, for the connectedness, if we've had a bunch of solo training, maybe we just did a huge base phase of solo zone 2 riding, and then they jump in the group ride again. I'll see, wasn't it fun? It wasn't fun to jump in that group again and rip it up with everybody there. And so those are three small examples of how autonomy, competence, and connectedness are interwoven into an endurance athlete's journey. And that plays on motivation because, again, if you can understand those three needs for yourself, you can understand how you're motivated. Now, motivation is not just one compartment or several compartments. Current research suggests that motivation is a spectrum. And I'll provide highlights of that today, but if this sparks curiosities, I'll circle back and tell you to read this article by Rob Griffiths, where he actually lays this out way better than I can do, but I'm going to pull on some threads that he writes more deeply about in that article, but I really suggest everybody reading that. And again, I'll link to it. So on this spectrum of motivations, we have anything from on one side of the spectrum being amotivation, which is a sports psychology term for not being motivated at all. Then we have varying degrees of extrinsic motivation. And then finally, on the opposite end of the spectrum from amotivation, we have intrinsic motivation. I'm going to break this down a little bit. I already said amotivation, that's not being motivated to do anything. Extrinsic motivation is being motivated by all sorts of external rewards. Okay. So if I go do a race, I get on the podium. That's an external reward. I finish the race, right? This is the satisfaction of completing something. That's an outcome, and that's still external. Fitness is gained, so you get this feedback from your friends and maybe your spouse. It's like, oh, you're looking super fit. Again, external reward. New equipment, all this kind of stuff can be very motivating to go do the sport more. Now, like I said, this spectrum of motivation includes a lot of extrinsic. When we talk about intrinsic motivation, this is simply doing something for the joy and the pleasure of doing that thing. So, in other words, you're going out for the long ride because you love the long ride. You don't care about the outcome. You can engage as much with it or disengage with it, and then it's equally enjoyable. Okay. And so that outcome or the podium is just not as important. You're more focused on the pursuit itself. It's racing to because you love the race itself without any attachment to the outcome. And that's intrinsic motivation. And so as we're experiencing these various arrays of motivation on that spectrum, you can create a lot of momentum through being motivated, right? You're essentially establishing good habits as an endurance athlete. You're gaining fitness, you're gaining performance, and again, you're gaining that momentum moving toward your goals. Like you as an athlete training for any big event this year or kind of in years, and you're seeking higher performance, we get a little weird in this sport, right? Because spending, 6, 8, 10, 12, I mean, sometimes if you're not time crunched, you spend upwards of 20, 25 hours on the bike, you can get a little obsessive, right? And it's nested in our sport a little bit. Maybe your spouse is like, oh man, you are obsessive. And I think that's part of an athlete's journey. Okay. We'll get into that a little bit more in part 2, but there's a balance here with it because the obsession that we have as endurance athletes or just as humans, because that can spill over into other aspects, it plays on passion. And passion is a separate emotion in itself, but in the way of what we're talking about here today, motivation increases passion. And so there's kind of the dualism of passions out there. You have harmonious passion and you have obsessive passion. In sports psychology, when we're talking about harmonious passion, we're thinking it's more balanced. Okay, you're in control. What you're doing is compatible with the rest of your life. You're motivated by doing the activity itself because it's pleasurable. It gives you energy, and you can engage and disengage equally. Very similar to intrinsic motivation in that way, anyway. Obsessive passion is you're controlled by your passion. You're driven to do that thing because that thing is like just pushing you and you have no control. Okay. Your passion for the activity is out of balance with the rest of your life. Okay. Meaning you're not spending as much time with your family. Maybe it's taken away from work time, those types of things. Your pursuit of goals is rigid compared to other activities in your life. You're very focused kind of on one particular thing, the Ironman goal, the Leadville goal, whatever it is. Everything else gets pushed aside. And finally, motivation is skewed because internal factors and external factors have tension there. Okay, so this tension starts internal and then all of a sudden gets manifested externally. And those are some components of that obsessive passion. And so as we look at the dualism of passion, I would encourage anybody listening here to seek more of the harmonious passion. I think in the long run, that gives you more happiness. That gives you actually better success and better outcomes in your sport, in your training. It's the long play. It gives you better outcomes with your family and any other relationships that you have at work or outside of endurance sport. And so there's these time periods where I think obsessive compassion will occur. And how do you navigate that, right? Like how do you play on some of this obsessive passion maybe, and how do you get toward harmonious passion? Well, I think there's no one answer. There's no one direction in that. This is where coaching the individual athlete or identifying the individual needs as a person really comes into play. But a very big key term, and the more I was like thinking about this, is you got to be very flexible with not only your training program, which we talk about on this podcast and other episodes, but you have to be flexible with your motivation. And I thought of this term as motivation flexibility. I made it up. I don't think this term is existing out there in the world. However, I like to work on definitions and things like this. So like just off the cuff, I think motivation flexibility is the willingness to allow oneself to feel all spectrums of motivation and learn how to change the plan if needed when circumstances change. You think about that, it's like, well, I kind of do that already. but do you? Okay, sure, you change the plan, or sure, your coach changes the plan when you text him or call him or her. And yeah, that's changing the plan. That's great. But when you feel something different, when you're not as motivated to hit the intervals on that day, do you allow yourself to be guilt-free, text your coach and have her give you the advice to kick it down a week or down a couple days or something like that? Do you allow yourself the freedom to feel the way you do? Okay. I think that's really important in the way of understanding and managing these ebbs and flow in motivation. My whole point in bringing this up and kind of bringing up this term motivation, flexibility, whatever it is to start to view yourself as just that, a human full of emotions, like we talked about. And your emotion or your motivation will come and go. It'll wax and wane. And that's super normal. So even though this is a term I made up, the concept is what I want to drive home. Okay. Think of it practically. You know that you're not as stoked in probably December as you are in January. Gearing up for a competition feels a lot different than gearing down after a competition. You want to allow those emotions in for sure, but just adjust the plan for it. And if you start with a really good plan, that will definitely help you to become more flexible with your motivation as it comes up, because the bigger plan more or less needs to stay in place. I mean, there's times and circumstances where it won't, right? But this flexibility in motivation will help you to make those micro adjustments in the training program on the particular day or week based on these feelings. And that's a very appropriate thing to do. And that's a very practical thing that we coaches do and athletes should be doing on a regular basis. And finally, as you're experiencing these different waves of emotion, you can go back to these SDT principles, exploring why you're feeling what you feel, and then how that applies to the spectrum of motivations throughout a training week, throughout a training block, throughout a whole year. Strive toward activities that develop your intrinsic motivations. And that's really going to help to, I would say, bring you toward that harmonious passion or a more balanced approach or more joy throughout this whole athlete journey. In the end, this is nothing drastically different from general concepts in coaching, which we've covered in previous episodes. A good athlete will learn how to adjust when things change, and a good coach will do the same. However, that's in regard to the training plan. What I'm referring to is the feel or the motivation, that desire that moves us. It's okay if that drive is not there sometimes. Take time to get it back. Or if it's there today, punch through the training, move the training up, and then adjust the plan on the back end. These micro adjustments, like I said, they can help you in the macro plan of development throughout your athletic journey. And what you learn about yourself, what your coach learns about you, can help develop better plans in the weeks and years to come. Okay, so let's summarize and take this thing home. We've identified that the endurance athlete is usually pretty motivated to do their training, but that can sometimes feel different as motivations change throughout the year. Current research in this field has led to self-determination theory, which helps us to identify why we are motivated to pursue the goals that we do. Varying degrees of motivation are best described as a motivation spectrum and can help better identify when and why an athlete is motivated or not. Having motivational flexibility can help the athlete and coach navigate the emotions felt throughout the athlete's journey, allowing them to change the plan when needed while still pursuing the bigger picture goal. Finally, seeking harmonious passion versus obsessive passion seems to be the better choice for the endurance athlete, though we walk a fine line on this by being endurance athletes. So I hope these terms and concepts I've laid out to you today provide a better toolbox, more tools in the toolbox to help you navigate your athlete journey. As I said in the start, we spend a lot of time on the podcast discussing how to do the physical actions of being an athlete. the mental side is just as important, if not more so. Motivation is that mental energy that drives the physical energy to do what we do with our intervals, our long rides, and everything that goes into the metrics that we talk about into this podcast. And then finally, I'll say this: I couldn't have done the podcast without some of the key references, which I'll link to in the show notes. My primary goal for this episode was to establish terms and concepts so that we could grow beyond that into some of the more actionable, doable stuff that's coming on in the next episode. And then finally, here's the ask. If you liked stuff around sports psychology, around motivation, around why we do what we do, let me know. Drop me a note. You can go over to trainright.com/podcast, and you will see a button there where it says ask a training question, and you can ask more questions about that, or you can simply give me feedback. And that's the best way to grow the show. That's the best way to let me know what you want to learn more of. And again, if you really enjoyed what you heard today, pass it along to a training partner, and they'll ask their questions too, and we'll just keep on learning and growing together.